How Jesus meets us in our grief at the tomb of Lazarus. Now a man named Lazarus was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay ill, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is ill." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back." Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daylight will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been there, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had sent this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth round his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go."
Thank you very much, Shirley, for reading that long and remarkable account of the raising of Lazarus. And in a time that we've been through over this past year, it's almost exactly a year, isn't it? Really, since the kind of pandemic swept through our country and many other countries, this whole question of Jesus meeting us in a time of mourning or grief has a particular kind of resonance. And not only that, but this particular story, account of the raising of Lazarus, has got so many levels to it. And I hope I can at least pick some of them out, but it is one of those, what we call Johannine passages, where there are many different depths to it. And I hope, as I say, we'll be able to look at some of it and tease out some of these extraordinary things. It's the fifth now of our series of 7 conversations with Jesus around different, as it were, parts of life. Today we're thinking about grief and mourning, the death of Lazarus, but also, of course, as we know from the story, his remarkable bringing back to life again, his resurrection. I think probably it is fair to say that apart from the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, quite probably the most dramatic event in St. John's Gospel. And also it is a climax of the 7 signs of the Gospel. There is one more miracle at the end of the Gospel that's generally called an epilogue, which is the catch of fish, which we'll be looking at in connection with Simon Peter. But this, in fact, is the 7th sign. And if you like, it's a kind of crescendo through which these different signs have, or to which these different signs have been moving. And so dramatic is it that artists down the ages have often depicted it either in paint or in sculpture. And I had a postcard which I picked up a few months ago when I went to Chichester Cathedral, and there they have a wonderful relief sculpture of this raising of Lazarus, which was done in the 13th century. So right back, people were depicting this because it was such a significant event, and no doubt it gave huge hope to people who suffered even worse things than we have this last year with plagues and so forth, Black Death, and those kind of things. Now, before we consider this story, I just want again to fill in, if I can, some of the things that we've sort of missed out since the last conversation in order to keep the sort of progression of the gospel. We were looking at, last time we met, at Jesus with the woman who was caught in adultery and that extraordinary story. And I won't go back over it, and we can listen again on the YouTube thing if you want to, if anyone didn't hear it. And in chapter 8, Jesus, just after that conversation with the woman caught in adultery, says, "I am the light of the world," a tremendous statement. And at the end of chapter 8, he says this other extraordinary "I am" saying, which the Jews found so hard to take. He said, "Before Abraham was, I am," using the divine name, which was not lost on them. He was claiming, therefore, greater status and seniority than Abraham, who was the father of the Israelite people. And this was, to the people listening to him, a most extraordinary claim. And all around this in chapter 8, there was a rising tension, so that at the end of the chapter, we find that Jesus actually is being stoned himself. It's quite ironic that he prevented the Pharisees from stoning the woman caught in adultery. And at the end of this chapter, he himself is faced by being stoned. At this, we're told in verse 59, they picked up stones to stone him. But Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds, just outside the temple. So that's chapter 8. Chapter 9 is another of the signs. It's the sixth sign, and the healing of the man who was born blind. It's another famous story, and we could have had another conversation out of it if we had time. This individual, this man who'd been born blind and whom Jesus healed on a Sabbath, was a very feisty man. He could answer back the Pharisees. And he said, I think, to the Pharisees at one point when they was getting at him to say, who healed you? He says, whether he, that is Jesus, is a sinner or not, because the Pharisees were saying he was a sinner because he healed this man on the Sabbath. Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. But one thing I know, once I was blind, but now I see. A wonderful, simple, profound statement about what had happened to him through the sign that Jesus had performed in his life. And then chapter 10, before we come to this great story of the death and resurrection of Lazarus, there is the teaching of Jesus about being the good shepherd. And this again comes out of a conversation with the Pharisees, and I imagine it was about leadership. What was true leadership for Israel? A question that the prophets had asked, particularly Ezekiel in chapter 34, is a whole chapter there about the prophets, or rather the shepherds of Israel. And Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I am the one who lays down his life for the sheep, and I take it up again. And my sheep hear my voice and listen to me. And there is one flock and one shepherd. And I am the good shepherd. I am the good leader. I am the model leader. And Jesus takes them through this marvelous teaching about what it means to be a true shepherd, what it means to be a good leader. And then there's further conflict, as there seems so often to be in these chapters, between Jesus and some of the people there. Again, he was back in Jerusalem. And in the end, at the end of chapter 10, which is just before, obviously, we get to our story now, Jesus again leaves Jerusalem. So in verse 40, you can have, I'll just read it out in chapter 10. It says, then Jesus went back across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing in the early days. And there he stayed. So he's left Jerusalem. He hasn't gone north to Galilee. He's gone, I think, further east, the other side of the Jordan River, where John the Baptist was first baptizing at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, just before. And there he removes himself out of the sort of conflict zone of Jerusalem. And he has a fruitful ministry there, we're told in verse 42. And in that place, many believed in Jesus. And it's while he was there that he gets the news. While he's away, the other side of the Jordan River, away from Jerusalem, he gets the news from Bethany, which is a village not too far away from Jerusalem. I think just up and over from the Mount of Olives and a little bit on, just a few miles from Jerusalem. And we come to this remarkable story, remarkable event. And it's difficult to know how to take it, to tease out all the different aspects, but I'm going to do it very simply. I want us to focus on Jesus. I want us to focus on Martha. And I want us to focus on Mary. And Lazarus, we don't really need to say much about him. He is the person about whom it's all about. But for the story, he's dead in his tomb until at the very end, he's brought back to life in this extraordinary event. And so let's just first, I want to focus on Jesus. He has, as I say, left Jerusalem. He's with his disciples near the Jordan River. He gets the message that Lazarus is ill. So, in fact, in verse 3, we're told the sisters, that's Mary and Martha, of course, Martha and Mary, send word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is ill. And that begins the whole narrative. And what I want to focus on, if I may, is this combination in Jesus in his response, not only here to this message, but also later on when we come to him being close to the tomb, is this wonderful fundamental combination in him of the human and the divine. We have seen this already displayed at the story of the woman at the well, when Jesus, you remember, was tired, a sign of his humanity, and asked for a drink. And he sat down by the well, and then she supplied his need, and then they had the conversation all about water, which you'll remember. But all the way through the Gospels, St. John is at pains to display Jesus as both human and also divine, the Son of God, the Messiah. And from the very beginning in John chapter 1 in the prologue, we hear about this, where we're told that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was part of the Godhead from eternity. And then in verse 14, which again has resonance with this story because of the word glory, which will come out on one or two occasions in the story, we're told the Word became flesh, incarnation, and made his dwelling among us. And we've seen what his glory, perhaps even as he wrote this or dictated this, John was thinking of this event of the raising of Lazarus. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John is showing us in these selected 7 signs the glory of the Word made flesh, from whom comes grace and truth. And this humanity, this divinity, is affirmed particularly in 2 places in the narrative. Before he leaves to go to Bethany, whilst he's at this place near the River Jordan, firstly, and then secondly, in the village of Bethany and near the tomb of Lazarus. So let me show you how that is the case in both these parts of the narrative. Firstly, by the River Jordan. John introduces the family of Lazarus to us at the beginning of the story, and we'll hear again of them in the following chapter, in fact. Now, a man named Lazarus was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And then in parenthesis, it puts this Mary, little editing, editorial statement. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay ill, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord, which we're going to see if we get to it in John chapter 12, I think it is, who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. Say Mary. So the sister sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is ill. And then later on, just verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Now I love that verse. Of course, Jesus loved everyone. But I think it's fair to say that there were particular people who he especially connected with. He was human. And indeed, one of them was the author of this gospel, who is called, he calls himself even the beloved disciple. And that was something which was known amongst the community of the church. So he wasn't, as it were, bigging himself up without reason. And here we're told that Jesus loved Martha and loved Mary and loved Lazarus. And of course, we can't separate the divine from the human in Jesus, as I'll say again later. But he had this, I think, human affection for this family. And he'd been to their home on possibly several occasions. And there was one occasion which is recorded in St. Luke's Gospel, which you'll probably know quite well, when he went there with all the disciples. And I'll come back to this in a few moments when we think of Martha and Mary. And there they were fed mostly by Martha, because Mary was sitting, if you remember the story in Luke chapter 10, is it? And Mary was sitting at his feet, Luke chapter 10 and verse 38 to the end, if you want to look at it at some time. So he loved them. He loved Lazarus. He loved Martha. He loved Mary. He would have been concerned that he was ill, very ill. And in fact, Jesus knew with his insight, his inner knowledge that he had, this illness, he says, will not end in death, but in the glory of God. But he says quite plainly later on, doesn't he, in the conversation, that Lazarus is dead. And so there is this sort of human side, the human affection and love, but also there is this divine side of Jesus as the Word, the eternal Son of God, the Word made flesh. So in verse 4 we read, this illness will not end in death. He knew that because of his divine understanding. It is for the God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. And this is a very interesting non sequitur. I think if I can point it out in that way. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was 2 more days. It's a non sequitur because you see, normally when you hear someone's ill and you love them, you go to them. And the reason why he didn't go to them immediately, and of course this comes up in the conversation later with Mary and Martha, is because he wanted them to see his glory. The glory which we spoke of in John chapter 1 and verse 14, the glory, we've seen the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So what we have is this extraordinary juxtaposition, you see, in these opening verses, even before he gets to Bethany, which display on the one hand his love, his human love and affection for the family, but also his divine knowledge, not only that Lazarus will die, but also that they'll see the glory of God through what Jesus, in the power of the Spirit, will do in raising Lazarus from the dead. So we have his humanity and his love, his divinity, and his glory, although one can't really, in fact, separate anything of these things out. They're all one. And then secondly, we see the same thing at the tomb. We'll talk more about the conversation between Jesus and Mary and Martha in a moment, but just to make these points at this point in my talk, that when Jesus arrives at the tomb, which he does, and obviously he has to walk there from across the Jordan, and he comes 4 days after the death of Lazarus, he states in this amazing way, this great I am saying, possibly to us, maybe the greatest of all the I am sayings. I don't know what you think. He says this, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. And then Jesus says, do you believe this? And there Jesus is speaking, isn't he, out of his authority, out of his divinity, out of being the Son of God, which actually Martha acknowledges in the conversation with Jesus. And we have all this huge statement and stuff. And yet by contrast, we have, even though he knows what he is going to do, we have the shortest verse in the whole of the New Testament, which, as you know, is he weeps. He weeps. And we can read that. I just lost it in the text. Yes, there it is in verse 34. Where have you laid him? Jesus says. Come and see, Lord, they replied. In verse 35, Jesus wept. He wept, I believe, because he was simply touched by the sorrow and the mourning and the grief of the people around him. With Mary, Martha, we don't know that she was weeping, but the other mourners who were there. And as they came nearer the tomb, then he was overcome himself. And his humanity expressed itself in his tears, in his weeping. So as we look at Jesus in this whole context of this narrative, I just wanted to point out that fundamental thing, which in a sense is obvious, but it needs to be said, that in this way, Jesus is acting both in his humanity and in his divinity. And the two are completely intermingled and interconnected in the one person that he is. And sometimes the early church, around about the 5th century, found this hard and wanted to either separate his divinity from his humanity. And as so often, there was a sort of controversy in church councils and all kinds of things to try and express the mystery of his being. Now, we've already heard from one of the what I call are known as the Cappadocian Fathers, and I just want to quote from one other who's called Gregory of Nazianzus, who was living at the same time as the other person I quoted on the Holy Spirit. He was called Basil of Caesarea. And Gregory of Nazianzus was in Constantinople. Some of you may have been to Istanbul. In 379 AD, invited there to preach a series of sermons. Orations, they were called, in the Anastasia Chapel. And someone, as he was speaking, was busy writing every word he said down. And I have it in the book here, what he said in 379 AD about the humanity and about the divinity of Jesus. Let me just read an excerpt from what is called Oration 29. Jesus is stoned, yet is not hit. He prays, yet he himself hears prayers. He weeps, yet he puts an end to weeping. He asks where Lazarus is laid. He was man, yet he raises Lazarus. He was God. He is sold, and cheap was the price, 30 pieces of silver. Yet he buys back the world at the mighty cost of his own blood. A sheep, he is led to the slaughter, yet he shepherds Israel. And now the whole world as well. A lamb, he is dumb, yet he is the word, and proclaimed by the voice of one crying in the wilderness. He is weakened, wounded, yet he cures every disease and every weakness. He is brought up to the tree and nailed to it, yet by the tree of life, he restores us. Now he captures, I think, Gregory wonderfully, he was a great stylist, the paradox of Jesus being both human and divine. And in this story, he says, doesn't he, can you tell me where we can find the tomb of Lazarus? Like he's an ordinary man. And yet when he gets there, he says, Lazarus, come out. And in the Gospel's words, those wonderful words, the dead man came out. I love that. Because dead men, they normally come out. He came out. So when we focus on Jesus, what we see in him is the combination of his humanity and his divinity, his love and his glory, and so on. So let's move to the second character that we're going to be looking at in this story, and that is Martha. Martha. Because this is a wonderful kind of expose of the character of these two sisters, of Martha and Mary. And how wonderful that they are there in the Gospels, because they represent us. We identify with one or with the other, and we see ourselves maybe in one or other of them. So we come to the sisters. So Jesus eventually gets there, and there's a little bit of conversation about he's going back to Jerusalem. And Thomas says, you know, why go back there? That we're about to kill you last time. Then Thomas says, I'll go with you and I'll die with you. And he was sort of full of bravado and so on. The same Thomas who didn't, of course, believe initially that Jesus rose from the dead. We could come to that later in the gospel. And then on his arrival, verse 17, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles, we're told, geography here, from Jerusalem, so it's close by. And many Jews from Jerusalem had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. And when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. But Mary stayed at home. Now that, in a way, says it all. And I think there is a profound point here about grief and about mourning. That according to our personality, according to our character, then we deal with it in different ways. There is never one way, as we know, to deal with grief. It will take each of us differently, and we don't know how it will take us until we meet with it. And that's part of the profound experience of being a human being and being who you are and who I am, and how we behave in the context of grief and of mourning. And this is as much true as us as it was true of Martha and Mary, and we know something about their character from that passage in Luke chapter 10 that I don't have time to read through, but you know the story, don't you, how Jesus and the 12 disciples turn up to their house in Bethany. And Martha is busy, doing what needed to be done, which is to provide the food. And Mary, you remember, sat at Jesus' feet. So let me read verse 40. Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made, and she came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Well, you can understand her feelings. Tell her to help me. And then I love the way the Lord says it. He says her name twice. Martha, Martha. I think that's rather good. You are worried and upset about many things, but really few things in life are needed. That's what he's saying. Or indeed, he says only one. And Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. So Martha was, as we would say in our modern jargon today, stressed by all the work that she was doing, and Mary, by contrast, was sitting at Jesus' feet. And although Jesus said to Martha, Mary has chosen the best part, and that would be good for you too, I don't think in any way he was denigrating what she was doing and the service that she was offering to Jesus and the disciples. What we see is this about their personalities, that Martha is the activist. We see it in several places in this whole story. She is the one who sees, and when she sees, she does. You understand that? She cannot sit down when she sees something that needs to be done. She is the activist. That is how she has been made. That is her personality. And Mary, by contrast, is the contemplative, is the one who waits and listens, sometimes to her sister's annoyance. And isn't it indicative, you see, that Martha is the one who gets up when she hears that Jesus has come to the village and goes out of the house immediately to meet him. And Mary typically stays where she was. when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. And I suppose we could say, couldn't we, that they acted therefore in character. And I would say to us as we listen to the story that all of us are somewhere on this spectrum between this activism on the one hand and contemplation on the other. And in fact, many of the great saints down the years would say the best thing is to have both, to be both contemplative and also to be active, to recognize that in other people and sometimes to encourage one to be more active, the other to be more contemplative, in order to be more whole, holistic. So Martha goes out and she says these interesting words: if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, there is in that statement, of course, is repeated by Mary. No doubt they talked together about why Jesus hadn't turned up and had waited for those days and had only arrived after 4 days after Lazarus's death. But within that saying, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. And there is a sense, isn't there, of disappointed hopes. If only you'd been here, it wouldn't have happened. And maybe just a slight undercurrent of reproach. Well, why didn't you come? We know that you love us as a family. Why didn't you turn up? But Martha, bless her, is also courageous. And goes on to say, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. She's by no means faithless. And Jesus, sort of leading her on a bit, says, your brother will rise again. And Martha says, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Yes, I know that that's part of my belief system, I know. But in a way, it doesn't help us now. And then Jesus comes out with his great I am, saying, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? It's almost as if Jesus is fetching out of Martha that implicit faith she's already expressed, so that she can, as it were, stick her courage to believing in the promise and the words of Jesus. As I said earlier, possibly one of the greatest I am sayings in the whole of the gospel, possibly one of the greatest things that Jesus said. Words of divine promise, words that I use as a clergyman every time I take a funeral service. We utter them as one of the sentences. Words that no one else has ever said in history and then proven in life. But it's not a hollow saying. As J.R. Tolkien said, the great author, the resurrection preeminently has the inner consistency of reality and truth. It is, of course, what makes Christianity Christianity, the resurrection. So we have Jesus and Martha, and then the third character, Jesus, Martha, and now Mary, Jesus and Mary. You see, it's Martha who goes back to the house. I love the details. Verse 28, and after she had said this, that's to say her declaration of faith in Jesus, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who's come into the world, a great statement of faith by Martha. After she'd said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside and said, the teacher is here, and he is asking for you. How lovely. You know, she sat in the house, probably overcome, almost certainly overcome by her sorrow and her feelings. And now she has his invitation to leave, to go back with Martha and to meet Jesus, who has remained outside the village, we're told. And when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. And then the Jews thought that she was going to the tomb to mourn there. Verse 32, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was, presumably sitting, perhaps or standing, saw him, typically Mary, she fell at his feet. Just as in chapter 12, the very next chapter is Mary, who will take the most expensive thing she owns and pour it on Jesus and wipe his feet with her hair. It was the type of person that she was. She fell at his feet, and interestingly, she said the same words, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Presumably, as I say, that must have come out of a discussion between the two sisters, thinking about the whole 4 days that they'd waited for Jesus to arrive. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who'd come along with her also weeping, he himself, you see, touched by the sorrow of the people here, was deeply moved in spirit and troubled, even though he knew what he was going to do. And says, where have you laid him? And they say this famous sort of remark in St. John's Gospel that comes up, come and see. And then Jesus wept. And then, of course, some of the Jews who are keen to criticize him said, see how he loved him. If he can open the eyes of the blind, surely he could helped or prevented Lazarus from dying. Jesus knew what he would do there. So we see here the raw emotion of mourning, the raw emotion of grief. C.S. Lewis, in his famous book, Observing His Own Grief After the Death of his wife, who he had barely married in hospital before she died, who had cancer, you remember the story, then wrote as a kind of diary his experience of grief following that event. He begins it by saying this quite tellingly. No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I'm not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. I kept on swallowing. The fact is, it's a physical thing. And that, no doubt, is what they were experiencing at that moment, that the friends of the family, Mary herself, and also Jesus, he wept. And so they came to the tomb. We know the amazing story, take away the stone. And who says, do you really want to do that? It's Martha. Martha, who's a practical one, says, there'll be a bad smell, she says. But, Lord, said Martha, the sister, by this time there is a bad odor, for he's been there 4 days. And then Jesus replied, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? And then Jesus rather wonderfully prays to the Father. He only does, we're told there in the Gospel, John chapter 5, he only does what he sees the Father doing. The two of them, as it were, do the thing together. They take away the stone. Jesus prays. And then he calls out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And then this marvelous statement, the dead man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth round his face. It was the power of resurrection. And of course, there is, if you like, a precursor here to Jesus' own resurrection, only a few chapters away, which we will come to. But it shows Jesus' authority over death. on 2 or 3 occasions. I don't know if you've ever been there. There is a church in Istanbul, Constantinople. It's called Chora, Chora. It means fields, and it's just outside the original city walls. And it's the most beautiful small church with wonderful wall covering pictures and mosaics, frescoes. And there's one which I saw a number of years ago when first going there. It's of Jesus raising up Adam and Eve out of the grave. And I'm going to show you, I put it on the front cover of the first book I ever wrote. And I don't know if you can see it there, but there's Jesus in the middle. And he's raising up with both hands Adam and Eve, the Lord of life. If you ever get a chance to go there, it is truly wonderful. And so we see in Jesus here this wonderful combination that he is the Word made flesh, the one who comes alongside us as a friend, and the one who loves us in our time of grief or grieving. As the writer of the Hebrews says, for we do not have a high priest who's unable to feel sympathy for our weaknesses, but we have one who's been tempted in every way, just as we are. He knows the trials and is affected by them too. He is a human friend, but also he is a divine Lord who says, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And the one who lives and believes in me will never die. And then as Jesus said to Martha in the midst of her grief, do you believe this? And only you can answer that, fully, firmly, humbly, like she did. And she said, yes, Lord, Martha said, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. So the seventh sign, perhaps a crescendo of all the signs, before we go into literally the passion narratives which follow from John chapter 12 onwards, leading to Jesus' own crucifixion, and then, of course, his own resurrection. So thank you for listening, even longer today. So we have so much to cover, but time for some questions and reflections from us now. Thank you.